Okay. So, a little bit more background. Sermon was delivered at the service of prayer and thanksgiving, the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, headquarters of Episcopal Diocese of New York State, an ecumenical program commencing the second anniversary of the desegregation decision. 12,000 people attended the event. Oh, okay. So this just happened to be on the same page. It's unrelated to the speech, but still. Okay. We figured it out. We've navigated the PDF. Sorry about that. 12,000 people attended the event. Several other ministers shared the platform with King, including Clay Maxwell, senior pastor of Mount Oliver Baptist Church, and James A. Pike, dean of the cathedral. Later that evening, with his parents in attendance, King delivered a realistic look at race relations at an annual dinner sponsored by the NAACP, Legal Defense and Educational Fund, held to commemorate the Brown decision. He had preached death of evil upon the seashore at least twice in the past, including once at Dexter in 1954. Tells the biblical story of Exodus from Egypt, comparing the Israelites' captivity with the plight of African Americans. Many years ago, black people were thrown into the Egypt of segregation, he writes. A world-shaking decree by the 9 justices of the Supreme Court of America, the Red Sea was opened, and forces of justice marched through the other side. I remember the program as one of the greatest experiences of my life. Okay. The listener's praise was equally effusive. Dean Pike called King's presentation the greatest sermon he had ever heard. The text reprinted here was probably published by the organizing committee which received King's address several days before the event. Okay. And Israel saw the Egyptians dead upon the seashore. Exodus 14:30. There is hardly anything more obvious than the fact that evil is present in the universe. It projects its nagging, prehensile tentacles into every level of human existence. We may debate over the origin of evil, but only the person victimized with a superficial optimism will debate over its reality. Evil is with us as a stark, grim, and colossal reality. The Bible affirms the reality of evil in glaring terms. It symbolically pictures it in the work of a serpent, which comes to inject a discord into the beautiful, harmonious symphony of life in a garden. It sees it in nagging tares disrupting the orderly growth of stately wheat. It sees it in a ruthless mob hanging the world's most precious character on a cross between 2 thieves. The Bible is crystal clear in its perception of evil. But we need not stop with the glaring examples of the Bible to establish the reality of evil. We need only to look out into the wide arena of everyday life. We have seen evil in tragic lust and inordinate selfishness. We have seen it in high places where men are willing to sacrifice truth on the altars of their self-interest. We have seen it in imperialistic nations trampling over other nations with the iron feet of oppression. We have seen it clothed in the garments of calamitous wars, which left battlefields painted with blood, filled nations with widows and orphans, and sent men home physically handicapped and psychologically wrecked. We have seen evil in all its tragic dimensions. So in this, I believe that he's primarily referencing the Vietnam War, but also war more broadly. But, of course, to make it relatable, he's speaking of things that people have seen more recently. the World War II would also be in recent enough memory for many people. So, in a sense, the whole history of life is the history of a struggle between good and evil. There seems to be a tension at the very core of the universe. All the great religions have seen this tension at the center of life. Hinduism called it a conflict between illusion and reality. Zoroastrianism looked upon it as a tension between the god of light and the god of darkness. Platonism called it a conflict between spirit and matter. Traditional Judaism and Christianity called it conflict between God and Satan. Each of these religions recognize that in the midst of the upward climb of goodness, there is the downpull of evil. This is a really interesting passage to me because speaking positively and relatably of other religions is not something that I see in certainly the white churches that I've attended. There's a kind of obsession with asserting that there's only one valid religion and all others should just be not even really acknowledged or should be struggled against. Really interesting. I would love to interrogate that further. Maybe there's deeper writings of how he viewed religion and faith in general. The Hebraic Christian tradition is clear, however, in affirming that in the long struggle between good and evil, good eventually emerges as the victor. Evil is ultimately doomed by the powerful insurgent forces of good. Good Friday may occupy the throne for a day, but ultimately it must give way to the triumphant beat of the drums of Easter. A mythical Satan, through the work of a conniving serpent, may gain the allegiance of man for a period, but ultimately he must give way to the magnetic redemptive power of a humble servant on an uplifted cross. Evil may so shape events that Caesar will occupy a palace and Christ a cross, but one day that same Christ will rise up and split history into AD and BC, so that even the life of Caesar must be dated by his name. Biblical religion recognized long ago that William Cullen Bryant came to see in the modern world. Truth crushed to earth will rise again, and what Carlyle came to see, no lie can live forever. Hey, Epic Prawn. We're going through sermons and speeches by Martin Luther King. A graphic example of this truth is found in an incident in the early history of the Hebrew people. You'll remember that at a very early stage in our history, the children of Israel were reduced to the bondage of physical slavery under the gripping yoke of Egyptian rule. Egypt was the symbol of evil in the form of humiliating oppression, ungodly exploitation, and crushing domination. The Israelites symbolized goodness in the form of devotion and dedication to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. These two forces were in a continual struggle against each other. Egypt struggling to maintain her oppressive yoke, and Israel struggling to gain freedom from this yoke. Finally, however, these Israelites, through the providence of God, were able to cross the Red Sea and thereby get out of the hands of Egyptian rule. The Egyptians, in a desperate attempt to prevent the Israelites escaping, had their armies go in the Red Sea behind them, but as soon as the Egyptians got into the Red Sea, the parted waves swept back upon them, and the rushing waters of the sea soon drowned all of them. As the Israelites looked back, all they could see was here or there a poor drowned body beaten upon by the seashore, or beaten upon the seashore. For the Israelites, this was a great moment. It was the end of a frightful period in their history. It was a joyous daybreak that had come to end a long night of their captivity. This story symbolizes something basic about the universe. It symbolizes something much deeper than the drowning of a few men, for no one can rejoice at the death or the defeat of a human person. This story, at bottom, symbolizes the death of evil. It was the death of inhuman oppression and ungodly exploitation. Just a moment. The cat in? Cat wants in. The death of the Egyptians upon the seashore is a glaring symbol of the ultimate doom of evil in its struggle with good. Okay, so I'm actually going to pause here. I want to roll this back. So I know this isn't... He's not speaking explicitly to this, but there's another weird thought that stumbled into my head while I was reading this. Okay, so you have, the Israelites fleeing their persecution, and you have the Egyptian army is basically going after them. And this is... I know he's talking about this more broadly, but there's also kind of a weird parallel in this in other ways as well. So like, and the unfortunate thing in reality and through the course of history is it's not resolved all at once. The struggle is a bit more protracted. But like with the ending of chattel slavery, for example, the parallel of continuing to pursue the enslavement of this parallel black people was the inception of an implementation of what we now know as modern police, the slave catchers, who did continue to round people up, and then eventually changed jobs to just, making arrests and keeping the peace and whatnot, or at least that's what their on paper job was. In practice, it was to continue to keep black people in bondage. And what we need is that crash of waves back in. Right now, yeah, that pursuit is still very much on and alive. Anyway, I weird thoughts jump into my head sometimes. I wanted to go on a tangent there. Continuing on. King is much better at driving points than I am. Yeah, the death of the Egyptians upon the seashore is a glaring symbol of the ultimate doom of evil in its struggle with good. There is something in its very nature, in the very nature of the universe, which is on the side of Israel in its struggle with every Egypt. And this is not Israel and Egypt specifically, this is metaphorically. There is something in the very nature of the universe which ultimately comes to the aid of goodness in its perennial struggle with evil. There's something in this universe which justifies James Russell Lowell saying, "Truth forever on the scaffolding, wrong forever on the throne. Yet that scaffold always..." I don't know the cadence of this. Truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. Yet that scaffold sways the future, and behind the dim unknown stands God within shadow, keeping watch above his own. We have... Can I get... Just a moment. I want to hear someone actually recite this.
We shall overcome. Deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome. Though I join hands so often with students and others behind jail bars singing it, we shall overcome. Sometimes we've had tears in our eyes when we joined together to sing it, but we still decided to sing it. We shall overcome. No, before this victory is won, some will have to get thrown in jail some more, but we shall overcome. Don't worry about us. Before the victory is won, some of us will lose jobs, but we shall overcome. Before the victory is won, even some will have to face physical death. But if physical death is the price that some must pay to free their children from a permanent psychological death, then nothing shall be more redemptive. We shall overcome. Before the victory is won, some will be misunderstood and called bad names and dismissed as rabble-rousers and agitators, but we shall overcome. And I'll tell you why. We shall overcome because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. We shall overcome because Carlyle is right. No lie can live forever. We shall overcome because William Cullen Bryant is right. Truth crushed to earth will rise again. We shall overcome because James Russell Lowell is right. Truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. Yet that scaffold sways the future. Behind the dim unknown standeth God within the shadow, keeping watch above his own. We shall overcome because the Bible is right. You shall reap what you sow. We shall overcome. Deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome. And with this faith, we will go out and adjourn the councils of despair and bring new light into the dark chambers of pessimism. And we will be able to rise from the fatigue of despair to the buoyancy of hope. And this will be a great America. We will be the participants in making it so. And so as I leave you this evening, I say, walk together, children. Don't you get weary. There's a great camp meeting in the corner.
Okay. So, there was more in that segment than just that poem, but I wanted to at least hear the cadence of that poem. And I'm sure we'll get to that speech soon as well. Maybe not tonight, but I plan on covering these. So I want to do a series where I cover these and some of the speeches by Malcolm X as well, some of his writings, and also Fred Hampton. I think that these would be good things to cover. But anyway, I wanted to get the actual cadence of this poem, and that was in there, so good. He has a very powerful way of speaking, for sure. Let's see. So, notice how we have seen the truth of this text revealed in the contemporary struggle between good in the form of freedom and justice and evil in the form of oppression and colonialism. Gradually, we have seen the forces of freedom and justice emerge victoriously out of some Red Sea, only to look back and see the forces of oppression and colonialism dead upon the seashore. There are approximately 2. Okay. Nope. Bye. There are approximately 2.4 billion people in the world today. The vast majority of these people are found in Africa and Asia. More than 1.4 billion of these people of the world are found on these two continents. 50 years ago, most of these people were dominated politically, exploited economically, segregated, and humiliated by some foreign power. Fortunately, in many ways, they still are. It's just not quite as explicit. Actually, I'm gonna report that guy. Give me just a moment. Because, yeah, that doesn't need to exist anywhere. Imagine simping for fascism. Get out of here. Okay. There were 400 million persons in India and Pakistan under the iron feet of British rule. There were 600 million persons in China under the gripping yoke of British, Dutch, and French rule. There were 100 million persons in Indonesia under the oppressive hands of Dutch rule. 200 million persons in Africa dominated and exploited by the British, the Belgium, the French, and the Dutch. The great struggle of the 20th century has been between these exploited masses questing for freedom and the colonial powers seeking to maintain their domination. So, one of the questions I hear a fair bit is what people speculating about what he would think about this or that international conflict. And I think this passage in this sermon makes it pretty clear that, first of all, military intervention is just explicitly evil. Imperialism itself is explicitly evil. Colonialism, the same. But also the exploitation of people, economically. And this doesn't have to be international, I would say. This sermon, more than the others that we have read, has Martin Luther King starting to express more open anti-imperial and anti-capitalist sentiments, which we'll see gets more and more clear in later speeches. What we are seeing now is this struggle. In this struggle is the gradual victory of the forces of freedom and justice. The Red Sea has opened, and today, most of these exploited masses have won their freedom from the Egypt of colonialism and are now free to move toward the promised land of economic security and cultural development. As they look back, they clearly see the evils of colonialism and imperialism dead upon the seashore. In our own struggle for freedom and justice in this country, we have gradually seen the death of evil. Many years ago, the black person was thrown into the Egypt of segregation, and his great struggle has been to free himself from the crippling restrictions and paralyzing effects of this vicious system. For years, it looked like he would never get out of this Egypt. The closed Red Sea has always stood before him with discouraging dimensions. There were always those pharaohs with hardened hearts who, despite the cries of many a Moses, refused to let these people go. But one day, through a world-shaking decree by the 9 justices of the Supreme Court of America and an awakened moral conscience of many white persons of goodwill, backed up by the providence of God, the Red Sea was opened, and the forces of justice marched through to the other side. As we look back, we see segregation caught in the rushing waters of historical necessity. Evil, in the form of injustice and exploitation, cannot survive. There is a Red Sea in history that ultimately comes to carry the forces of goodness to victory, and that same Red Sea closes in to bring doom and destruction to the forces of evil. What is this doing? This is largely saying, yeah, it does. When you realize that MLK was at Selma. Is this some Christian anarchism? I don't know. This is saying we have won some of these fights, but the fight is still on. But he is giving people reason to hope. He's saying that these vestiges of injustice, they still exist, and the Red Sea will come to wash them out. Don't lose hope. And also don't accept that even though we've gotten this far, that we can just settle down. He is very clearly framing this as, still a fight of good versus evil in the pursuit of this justice. All good, Ricky. Yeah, Bing, totally agree. This is our hope. This is the hope and conviction that all men of goodwill live by. It is at bottom of the conviction that all reality hinges on moral foundations, and that the whole cosmic universe has spiritual control. It is therefore fitting and proper that we assemble here, just 2 years after the Supreme Court's momentous decision on desegregation, and praise God for his power and the greatness of his purpose, and pray that we gain the vision and the will to be his co-workers in this struggle. Let us not despair. Let us not lose faith in man, and certainly not in God. We must believe that our prejudiced mind can be changed, and that man, by the grace of God, can be lifted from the valley of hate to the high mountain of love. Let us remember that as we struggle against Egypt, we must have love, compassion, and understanding goodwill for those against whom we struggle, helping them to realize that as we seek to defeat the evils of Egypt, we are not seeking to defeat them, but to help them as well as ourselves. This is a message that tragically many a bigot has hardened himself to. So many people, especially conservatives, view rights in general as a zero-sum game, that if somehow someone else is elevated or has rights, that somehow that means they have less of them. King is certainly a lot more patient than I am with conservatives. that is hard. Well, I guess it wasn't even conservatives at the time. It was just the typical white attitude towards black people. Like, but anyway, that is, yeah. God has a great plan for this world. His purpose is to achieve a world where all men will live together as brothers, and where every man recognizes the dignity and worth of all human personality. He is seeking at every moment of his existence to lift men from the bondage of some evil Egypt, carrying them through the wilderness of discipline, and finally to the promised land of personal and social integration. May it not be that this is entirely within the realm of possibility? I prefer to live by the faith that the kingdoms of this world shall become the kingdoms